Hello and welcome. How important is the war in Afghanistan in keeping Britain safe? And has the price paid in terms of lives really been worth the mission? And that's a question the British public has been asking more and more as the death toll continues to rise and the war enters its 9th year. In fact, 2009 marked the deadliest year yet for UK forces in Afghanistan as its army took over responsibility for some of the most troubled areas in that country. Now, as part of the escalation of NATO forces there, British troop numbers will rise to 10,000. Under criticisms that they are inadequately armed and outfitted for this type of warfare, the public is becoming increasingly divided over the mission, its goals, and whether or not Great Britain actually has a strategic interest in Afghanistan. On today's show, we continue our special look at the role of United Kingdom's forces in Afghanistan and ask, how can a nation divided find victory in Afghanistan? Remember, you can join in our conversation with your questions and comments. Just send us an SMS or an email and we try to include them into the show. And joining me now from Leeds is Sue Glenton, a key figure in the Stop the War coalition. Her son, Lance Corporal Joe Glenton, has refused to return to service in Afghanistan and was an outspoken opponent of the war until he faced a gag order. He's awaiting a hearing in just a few days' time. From London, I'm joined by Labour Member of Parliament Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Corbyn's been a vocal opponent of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and serves on the steering committee of the Stop the War coalition. He was first elected to Britain's Parliament in 1983. Also in the London studio is Amyas Godfrey, an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Mr. Godfrey attended Sandhurst and was commissioned as a regular infantry officer into the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, serving for 7 years on operations in Northern Ireland and Bosnia. Most recently, he completed 2 tours of Iraq. He supports Britain's efforts in Afghanistan. I welcome you all to the programme. And Sue Glenton, if I could start with you there in Leeds and ask, what is the current status with your son Joe? I mean, how is he holding up as he awaits this next hearing coming up on Friday? What's he expecting to happen?
We're not sure what's going to happen. He's been diagnosed with PTSD recently by a civilian psychiatrist. He's receiving treatment for this after the army failed to diagnose it or do anything about it. So we're just waiting to see what happens on Friday now.
What made him, Sue, what made him such an outspoken critic of the war? What made him come out so vocally against it and take such action?
His experience obviously led, well, I'm saying this is my opinion, his experience led him to believe that there was something seriously wrong.
Well, let me get a perspective here, because we have Amyas Godfrey, who served in the military and has a lot of experience in war zones as well. And I wonder, as someone who supports the war in Afghanistan and the military presence there and being an experienced military officer, how do you regard those in the forces who speak out against any campaign or war?
Well, certainly in my experience, I've gone from the Northern Islands, which are very much a home issue, through the Bosnias, which were a humanitarian issue, all the way to the Iraqs, which were fundamentally misunderstood, and now we're seeing potentially illegal war. There was many times throughout all of those operations when my soldiers came to me and said, what are we doing? Why are we here? And it's perfectly acceptable for a soldier to try and understand and get to grips with what they're doing. Now, war is an awful thing, and it is very easy to start losing the strategic reason of why you're there because of the awful tactical situation that you are in. And just listening to Sue there, it's very interesting. Exactly what she's saying about her son is there is a very famous British soldier, Siegfried Sassoon, who was in my regiment, funnily enough, who was so horrified by the First World War and what was going on that he publicly denounced the war and said, I will take no more part in it. But eventually changed his mind because he felt there was nothing he could do about it, and he felt that he was letting down his fellow soldiers who had no choice but to go and fight. But I certainly wouldn't say that he's wrong in denouncing it. It's just you have a role in the military, and perhaps it was the wrong time to come out with it.
Well, that's what I wonder, considering the sort of the peer pressure that exists and the training and the camaraderie that brings people together. What real options are there for those who want to express to their superiors that this is something that perhaps they don't want to be part of, or they really can't face dealing with on the ground?
Well, we're very lucky to have a small professional army in which everyone is a volunteer within it in the British Army, and any soldier at any point is able to leave the armed forces. Even there is a 3 years minimum service, but even within those 3 years there is a great deal of leniency to leave for soldiers for any reason, whether it's something as serious as we're talking about here of completely not believing in the cause you're fighting, or just feeling that military life isn't for you. So there's quite a lot of scope to voice your opinions, but I'm very aware that it will be a very difficult position this young man is in, because your comrades who are still fighting might not see eye to eye with you and feel like they're being let down, and that's an awful position for him, and a very brave decision, but perhaps a bit misguided in how he's gone about it.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn, good to have you with us as well, sir. And I wonder, you know, Britain's currently holding an inquiry into the... Sure, Sue, I'll get back to you in just a second on that, actually. I do want to, because I have more questions for you on that issue as well. But I do want to get Jeremy Corbyn's opinion, because Britain's holding an inquiry into the invasion of Iraq and questioning why the Blair government took the country to war there, questioning whether or not it was legal. Do you expect any such kind of inquiry into Afghanistan, wondering why Britain ended up there too?
Well, we're moving into very different waters here, because in the case of Iraq, the inquiry is going on, and Blair gives evidence on Friday, and there may well be ultimately a declaration that the war was illegal, and I think the evidence that Lord Goldsmith is going to give is also going to be very interesting. If we end up with a position that there is a legal decision that the war in Iraq was illegal, then logically there would be an inquiry into Afghanistan. Now, I recognise the circumstances are different in that there was a UN resolution that supported the position of sending troops into Afghanistan, even though I disagree with it. But that might well interpret that there was no legitimate threat from Afghanistan, and what the US and Britain did was not an act of self-defense, was actually an act of aggression. That might well be decided. I think we're changing our whole approach to war, in which the legality is going to come first.
Well, I wonder, I was speaking with Bob Ainsworth, the Defence Secretary, just a day ago on the show, and asking why Britain was involved in these conflicts when there was no direct threat from Afghanistan, as you say. He says there was a duty for Britain to follow its allies into Afghanistan.
Well, that is not a legitimate reason for going into a war, because you might agree or disagree with your allies, you might like your allies or not like them, but that's not a reason. The reason for going to war has to be an act of self-defense against an act of aggression. But that is clear in the UN Charter.
That's not why the United States, for example, came into war in the Second World War. They came as part of allies against Germany, not against Japan. So I'd actually disagree and say there's a fundamental difference between Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's so many technical issues drawn up in why we're in Afghanistan. Get rid of the bellicose emotion of whether we should be there or not, but technically we are a NATO member, and a long time ago in the sort of 70s we made a fundamental strategic military decision that we cannot operate without the United States, and this follows up to now with our ability to operate abroad. And when it came to 9/11, which was an attack on the United States, they were fully in their rights to say, we have been attacked, we are therefore going to Afghanistan. And ourselves, sadly, as part of our own military capability, do have to support them, because otherwise we take a serious step down in our military capability.
Clearly a military alliance, things follow from having a military alliance, but is it logical to say that the government of Afghanistan decided to attack the United States on 9/11? That is the fundamental point, is it?
No, and the government of Afghanistan was a casualty in this, but the reason we're in Afghanistan is fundamentally because of 9/11. Well, I don't think we can get around that.
Let me get onto these issues in a second, because I do want to go back to Sue Glenton then. Sue, thanks for waiting patiently. I know you wanted to respond to the idea of how soldiers can express their dissent. Let me pick up on that conversation with you.
Okay, well, Joe did attempt to voice his dissent and went through the channels, the proper channels for this, and was ignored, completely ignored. So to say that, you know, you're a small family community in the services and every opportunity is available is a downright lie.
Now, Sue, it's interesting because you've written a number of articles, and you were saying that Joe and his colleagues were trained extensively about, before heading out to Afghanistan. You say they were told that they should report unethical or immoral deeds they saw there. Service personnel are obliged to report any wrongdoing. In Afghanistan, Joe questioned whether the war was right or not. Now, as you say, he was totally ignored. So in this case, when he discussed it with you and you got some feedback from what was happening there, what was your sense of how he was handling it?
He didn't discuss it with me. He didn't discuss it with me. I knew he was suffering when he came back. There was a definite change in personality. His behaviour was very different, and I believe he's had PTSD since he came back from the tour. He was very limited in his conversation about his experience.
I'll get back onto how that's played out into what's happening now as well. But Amias, I want to ask you a little bit about the experience going out into some of these tough places that you've had personal experience of as well. Now, was there ever a time in your own career where you questioned a mission or a campaign?
No, there wasn't, actually. I felt very much that I had joined the British military as a citizen of this country. Ironically, I wasn't actually a citizen of Britain when I joined the army. I was a Canadian citizen. But I felt very much that, unlike what Sue was saying, I knew that at any point, if I was in a situation where I felt that unethical behavior, whether it was against the Geneva Convention or just unethical, that I was fully within my rights not to follow an order. And I have to say, in my experience of the 3 major operations that I've been on, and twice serving in Iraq, I didn't personally ever see any unethical behavior. It really comes down to what you start splitting hairs about. Yes, there were gunfights with insurgents. Yes, there were roadside bombs that went off and reactions to them. I was the intelligence officer on my second tour, and therefore was charged with investigating situations and so on. And I personally saw no unethical behavior, but I will fully defend the idea that sometimes things go badly wrong, and this is a fundamental problem with war, in that when you pit 20-year-olds against 20-year-olds on both sides, the red mist will come down and things will go wrong. That is a fundamental part of war.
I'm just going to pause for a second. Sorry, Mr. Corbyn.
Okay.
The reason is we've got a caller from Egypt who's holding on. Felisa,
sure.
Let's squeeze in your question before we have to take the break, because I know you've been waiting patiently.
According to the British law and the United States law, when somebody kills a human being, innocent human being, is considered as a criminal according to the Western law. And according to the United Nations law, the war in Iraq is illegal. So I think your guest, Amos, with his, with due, respect, I think he's a criminal, just like him, like all the British and American soldiers that are fought in Iraq, according and plus to their leaders, whether they are politicians or whatever they are.
I'll pick up. Felisa, I'm going to pick up on your point on whether or not the war is legal in a second with our guests and give Amias a chance to answer as well. We're going to take a very short break here. More of the discussion in a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're continuing our special coverage of some of the key issues facing the British public ahead of the general election this summer. As we look at the role the UK is playing in the war in Afghanistan, I'm joined by Sue Glenton, a key figure in the Stop the War coalition, whose son, Lance Corporal Joe Glenton, refused to return to service in Afghanistan. She's in Leeds. From London, Labour MP Jeremy Corbyn, also involved with the Stop the War coalition and a vocal opponent of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also Amias Godfrey of the Royal United Services Institute, who most recently completed 2 tours in Iraq. He supports Britain's efforts in Afghanistan. Let's get back to questions. And first, Jeremy Corbyn, this idea our caller in Egypt, Felisa, had about that the war, if innocent people are killed, it's actually a criminal act. Now,
well, the war in Afghanistan we're discussing, the war in Iraq, I believe, is quite clearly an illegal war. There was no direct threat to Britain. There was no act of self-defence involved. And indeed, the General Secretary of the United Nations said as much at the end of the initial phase of that particular conflict. And that's not to say that every individual involved in the entire military has committed a criminal act. What it is to say is that those people, particularly Tony Blair, but others who presented that information to Parliament, who made those decisions, who ordered that particular conflict, they have a real problem on their hands about the legality of this war.
And I'll back that up by saying a military like the British military will go to Iraq, and in this example, as I did, in good faith that the government has presented an argument saying we are doing it because of this. It is not the opportunity for the entire army to mutiny because we all have independent opinions.
Go ahead, Sue. Yeah.
You will have heard of mission creep, and that's about the 7th reason that I've heard for the war in Afghanistan. If somebody comes up with a plausible reason, I'll listen. But that's about the 7th one I've heard. And I
think it's pretty straightforward. The war in Afghanistan is a cause and effect because 9/11, we therefore followed on. I agree with what Sue's saying. There's been
nobody from Afghanistan was in the 9/11 attacks.
However, it doesn't.
Right. I think Amias is agreeing to some point there now. But Sue, let me ask you one thing: how do you regard the public support for Joe? Demonstrations in New Zealand, Moscow, St. Petersburg. It's gone across the world in terms of taking up his case. Hundreds of letters I know you've had from military and ex-military personnel. How do you think that will help his case?
I think the 71% of the last poll in Britain who want the troops out, who can't see the point of this, who haven't had a reasonable explanation. You know, it's ridiculous. There are 250 people being killed in this conflict from Britain, and that's not counting the Afghanis. We don't register them, and there's 250 families and friends and communities who are suffering because of this. And tell me what the benefit is to this country or to Afghanistan.
A subject I'm going to get on with the gentleman I have with me here as well, but I want to get from you is, as you say that that Joe was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but you said you saw the signs. That was only in December from an independent civilian psychiatrist, but you said you saw the signs after he returned from Afghanistan the first time. What did you see? 2
years ago, yeah. His behaviour changed. He got very insular, very isolated, couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep.
And in terms of how that's been the response to that from the military, and when it's been presented to his superiors, did you get any reaction?
They didn't acknowledge it. Well, 2 years ago, they didn't acknowledge it at all. And he's just been diagnosed by a military psychiatrist, and they won't give a decision.
I wonder, I mean, how seriously is the military taking the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, and what is being done about it, from what you know?
Well, it's an incredibly serious issue in the military, and it is the same as being wounded in combat. Everyone who witnesses combat, I'm no doubt that I have it as well, to an extent. I'm not saying some people are affected far more than others, and seeing combat is an awful situation. I'm sure there are Afghanis fighting for the Taliban or not who are also suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is a fundamental fallout of warfare. And this is where, if we really want to get into what I think was fundamentally criminal about the war in Iraq, is that decisions were made to send young men and women to do a government's bidding, and was taken on good faith by a military, but no provision was taken for the casualties, not only physical casualties, but there will be an entire wave, a generation of military post-traumatic stress disorder, of which we knew about after the Falklands, because there was a huge wave of it after that, even though it was only 3 months in duration. We have this coming up, and that's what I feel is a leadership failure by Tony Blair.
Interestingly enough, that's something that we've discussed even happening to journalists who are out in war zones. But Jeremy Corbyn, I'm going to get your response in a sec. Let me put an email to you, please, if I could, that came from Paul Wolfe in Washington, D.C., who wrote in from the US saying, the gag order on Joe Glenton is outrageous. The UK signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees the right of free speech regardless of US law, of UK law. What are they afraid he will say?
Well, I think Joe Glenton's very brave, I think he's very honest, and I think he's also suffered a great deal. And I agree with you that I do think a large number of soldiers and civilians suffer from post-traumatic stress. Indeed, whole populations do. I was in Gaza last week. There's a whole population there that's suffering from that. I think that the behaviour of the British government towards Joe Glenton demonstrates very effectively the huge indecision about Afghanistan. I've been asking ministers for years, what is the point of the war in Afghanistan? What are the war objectives there? And they say it's things like to stabilise the situation, it's things like to bring about normality, and it goes on and on and on. And they know, I know, every viewer knows that at some point there will have to be a political settlement in Afghanistan. How many more lives are going to be lost till we reach that position?
Sue Glenton, I wonder to what degree you feel that the highlighting of Joe's case, the number of protests, the way the public has reacted, and not just to your son's case, but in general to the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, how much real change do you expect in the future? Do you think things might turn out a little more positive from your perspective in the long run?
I'd like to think so, but I was on the first Stop the War march where there were almost 2 million people in London, and nobody was listening then. And hopefully Blair's going to get his comeuppance this week, but we've waited a long time for that, and a lot of lives have been lost in the meantime.
You know, I wonder, Amias, there's not a lot of public support nowadays for the war in Afghanistan. I think the public, as in America, has war fatigue. A majority of Britons feel it's unwinnable. I wonder, you know, the head of the forces here saying that there is that lack of support at home, and it's more dangerous than the Taliban. I wonder to what degree that you feel, A, that's accurate, but also that that could undermine the way the military goes forward with any future military campaigns.
It will have I think, a very lasting effect in the same sort of way as a military historian. If you look back at the effect on the American army post-Vietnam, they were very reticent to get involved in anything for a very long time, including Bosnia and Kosovo, where Britain did get very much involved. And certainly, hearing that comment before, labelling me as a war criminal, I don't remember anyone labelling me as a war criminal as we defended Zagreb from the Serbians, as we held the Muslim enclaves there. But to each his own. I agree that Iraq is probably one of the worst foreign policy disasters since Suez and appeasement of Hitler, and it will rank among those. But as far as Afghanistan goes, I'm not.
They truly didn't learn a lot from Vietnam, though, did they? They've got very short memories.
Well, there is also many differences. We can't just say one war is just like the other. But I think we will suffer from this this battering of public opinion against the military.
Well, I've got about 30 seconds. I want Jeremy Corbyn to have the last word here. When you've defied the Labour whip a number of times, 200 plus times, and you've been one of the few voices to really express such strong dissent. Why wasn't there more of an outcry among the politicians if they were unhappy with Tony Blair and his government taking this?
Because they were afraid, because they were unable to raise things, because they followed tribal loyalties instead of their heads and their hearts. I knew very obviously from the very beginning that the dodgy dossier was just that, and Blair's blandishments and all the pressure on that big debate on March the 18th was quite disgraceful. Labour MPs and other MPs are responsible for voting for it. Well,
I hit the mark there, I'm afraid. But Jeremy Corbyn, thank you. Amias as well, and Sue Clinton, thank you very much for joining us. Now remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to there. Right now we're featuring a tongue-in-cheek exchange between me and my good friend Anand Naidu, who fills in for me on the show. Check it out. I'd love to get your feedback on it. And be sure to give us your feedback on the show in general. You can post questions and comments there. On the next show, fears of radicalism in the UK university system, given allegations that the failed Christmas Day bomber was introduced to extremist ideology while studying in London. What pressure is there to review the right to free speech on campus? Be sure to tune in for that debate from me and the teams in London and DC. We'll see you next time.